Welcome back to the second video in our series titled Emotions of Bipolar Disorder. As mentioned in the first video, we're going to talk about what guilt, shame, regret, and grief are, as well as a few tips on how to process these complex emotions. Today's video is going to focus on guilt. Special thanks to Healthline, Centerstone, and The Week for inspiring this video. We are complex creatures, and when we add something like bipolar disorder on top of typical human emotions like guilt, it makes it even harder to process. Bipolar disorder is like a giant magnifying glass that can make our emotions feel 10 times heavier. That being said, this video is not a fix-all. It might give you some direction or helpful tips, but ideally you should work with someone like a counselor on a regular basis to help you process feelings of guilt. It doesn't just happen overnight, and there's a lot of information to digest in this video. Guilt sure doesn't feel good, but it does have some redeeming qualities. Guilt has encouraged me to change and improve things about myself. It's helped me to have greater empathy for others and to be more honest. It's motivated me to take accountability for my actions and to make amends when I hurt someone. Guilt is a very normal and somewhat useful emotion, but when it starts to infringe upon our daily functioning, it might be time to seek professional help. As with most complex emotions, there's different types of guilt, and they can overlap. The three basic types of guilt are natural guilt, toxic guilt, and existential guilt. In a nutshell, natural guilt includes feelings of remorse over something we did or failed to do. Maybe you lied to a best friend, broke a promise, or put a dent in someone's car. Toxic guilt comes from a sense of not being a good person, letting others down, or feeling like a failure. I struggle with toxic guilt a lot when I'm depressed. It's this nagging feeling that everything is wrong with my life. Existential guilt is associated with trauma or situations in the world that we have no control over. Maybe you lost a loved one and have survivor's guilt. Maybe you see animals in cages or starving children in Africa and feel guilty inside. Existential guilt is more social or political. Regardless of what type of guilt we experience, it's not a fun feeling. Sometimes guilt is proportionate or relative to the situation at hand, and other times it can be quite disproportionate, where we ruminate over the bad times. All forms of guilt can disrupt our lives, especially when these feelings are magnified times 10 during a bipolar episode. Like I mentioned in the first video, there's a lot of guilt associated with my diagnosis, the people I've hurt, and choices I've made while symptomatic. Those of us living with bipolar disorder are no strangers to the different types of guilt. Now that we've laid the foundation for what we're going to talk about, let's get into some tips and exercises that might help. As with all my videos, please keep your expectations realistic. These tips might not penetrate through deep PTSD, complex survivor's guilt, or if you're in the middle of a severe bipolar episode. I'm still going to do my best, and I hope something I share brings a little more peace to your life. Tip number 1. There's 3 simple questions that you can ask yourself to give your guilt a reality check. Ask yourself if you were truly responsible for what happened. Ask if it makes logical sense for you to feel so bad about the situation. And lastly, did you make an actual mistake, or is someone making you feel guilty because you aren't doing what they want? These questions help us determine if the guilt is justified or not. Be very careful if you ask yourself these questions during a bipolar episode. Depression as well as guilt have a knack for distorting our perception of things. Tip number 2. If you did offend or hurt someone, work towards self-forgiveness. This multi-step process involves deep reflection and a commitment to make changes. Start by pinpointing what you did wrong and accept that you made a mistake. Acknowledge that you regret what happened and that you wish you did things differently. Assess if you were symptomatic or having a bipolar episode at the time. Ask yourself what you could have done differently and commit to doing those things in the future. This could include making changes to your bipolar treatment approach or educating those around you. Do your best to make amends with those you hurt. This isn't easy if they aren't willing to work with you. Do your best to accept responsibility and sincerely apologize without defending yourself. If there's something reasonable you can do to make it right, focus on that. All of these things will help you make peace with yourself. Unresolved feelings of guilt are like carrying around a giant weight. It's only heavy when you carry it. Think about that. It's only heavy when you carry it. Forgive yourself and practice letting go. Tip number 3. Sometimes we feel guilty about things that have nothing to do with us. If you're struggling with existential or disproportionate guilt, focus on adopting new habits that'll help you let go. I'm an empath, so it's very easy for me to take on other people's guilt and have it disrupt my own life. Practicing mindfulness has been very helpful for me personally. Once I've identified that the guilt isn't mine, I have to consciously practice letting it go. I have to keep reminding myself that there's nothing I can do about it but let go. I might have to remind myself every 30 seconds at first, but this is how we create new healthy ways of thinking. After some practice, it gets easier to identify and therefore not participate in unnecessary guilt. Like I mentioned earlier, it's only heavy when you carry it. This 4th tip is called naming or owning your guilt. We all know what happens when we stuff emotions inside and, quote, deal with them later. It creates a toxic emotional stew that just simmers until it boils over. Try your best to not ignore your feelings of guilt. Pinpoint those suckers and put a name to them as soon as possible. Here's how you can do this. Grab your journal or a notebook and set aside some quiet time. Use what we call I statements to summarize what happened. I feel guilty because I lost my temper with my partner. I feel guilty because I lied to my best friend. I feel guilty because I farted during a board meeting. You get the point. Identify the source of the guilt and write it down. Next, I want you to write down any other emotions that are associated with that guilt. Again, using I statements. I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel regretful, scared, etc. The act of writing down our feelings can help get them out. The final step is to sit with those feelings and explore them with curiosity instead of judgment. Focus on the feelings and not the act that caused them. What feels like this giant monster in our head becomes a few simplified sentences on paper. Practices like this help you become familiar with your emotions so you can identify and process them a little easier. This 5th tip is way easier said than done. Work on being gentle with your expectations of yourself, especially if your guilt comes from comparing yourself to others. We have bipolar disorder. It's not something we chose, but it's part of our reality. This could limit some of the things we might be able to do. Many of us beat ourselves up because of other people's expectations of success. This is something I'm constantly working on. Sometimes I feel guilty not working 50 hours a week like my brother does. He has a house and other measures of success that I don't. At the same time, people might think the same thing about my ability to create Polar Warrior videos. Someone might even feel guilty that I have all my arms and legs. When I was studying karate, my instructor used to humble me by saying, "There's always someone better." It's healthy to be inspired by others, but when we start feeling guilty that we aren't someone else, it only creates suffering. Remember that you are the best person in the world at being you. Moving on to tip number 6. I already know that I'm way harder on myself than any of my friends are. Knowing this, I'll try to imagine my guilt from a friend's perspective. I'll pretend one of my friends is having the same issues I am. What advice would I give my best friend? I'd never call them a loser and tell them to stuff their feelings inside, yet I do this to myself, and it just makes the guilt worse. Give yourself the benefit of the doubt that you would anyone else. I typically tell my friends that I love them, that this'll pass, and that they aren't alone. I'm learning to treat myself with the same loving kindness by slowly changing my internal monologue. Tip number 7. This is a neat technique for letting things go. When you start to feel guilty about something or someone, get a stick or a rock and write the name of your guilt on it. Next, throw it as far as you possibly can. As you throw it, exhale and picture all of those nasty feelings leaving your body. I've gone on walks and had to throw a guilt rock every few minutes because my mind kept going there. After a while, it gets easier. If you're at work or home in bed, you can't really start throwing rocks around, so visualize the technique. Picture yourself in a peaceful place with lots of rocks around. Throw as many guilt rocks as you need until your mind starts letting go. Again, that guilt rock is only heavy when you're carrying it. Tip number 8, use your guilty thoughts as a metric to gauge your bipolar symptoms. There are certain things I feel guilty about that only come up when I'm depressed. I don't typically dwell on these things when I'm well. Knowing this, I can use these feelings of guilt to warn me of an impending depressive episode. Part of the illness is not being able to tell when we are sick, so I'm always looking for ways to gauge my mood. The last tip that I'm going to share today is to be very clear about the difference between guilt and shame. As I mentioned in part 1, guilt would be like saying, I did something bad and feel guilty about it. Shame would be like saying, I'm a bad person because of what I did. If you determine that you're feeling more guilt than shame, consider watching this video again at a later time. There's a lot of information in here. Go through each tip slowly and implementing what you can into your own life. Take your time with this stuff and be extra patient with yourself. If your feelings are more shameful than guilty, well, I've got a whole video up next that'll talk about several ways to cope with shame. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and a very warm welcome to Polar Warriors. I hope something I said today resonates with you or provides you with a little bit of peace. As always, if you have questions or would like to contact me directly, there's a link in the video description. Stay well, and I hope you'll stop by the channel again soon for more Polar Warrior videos.